In the previous videos, we explored several routes that converged at the game's airport and identified the various points we could land after jumping out of a plane. 2 of them led to the game's first ending, but the third returns the player to the altered house and opens up a new route leading further. A couple of important things have changed on this visit to the altered house. Happily, the exterior doors have now regrown, and mysteriously the set of pictures of flowers above the couch in the living room has changed. Both of these things were triggered by a script that had been looping since the beginning of the level, similar to the airport bathroom check. Script 34 continuously checks for the existence of at least one object with the tag 1621, which are the same 8 artifacts checked by the aeroplane lock earlier that appear in the picture frames. If all of them have been picked up, the script will continue and perform the reverse of what happened when we picked up the blue skull earlier, restoring the outside doors and hiding the hallway cupboard. It will also reveal the new set of pictures in a similar way to the artifact images. The script will lower the floor of a thin sector with the tag 546, which is set to match the house's floor by a height transfer line def action. This sector is one map unit in front of the visible pictures and has the replacements as a mid-texture. Lowering it will make them fall into place in front of the existing ones. This new picture shows a gap in the fence at the west side of the house, near where we didn't pick up the soul sphere earlier on. By taking advantage of our newly restored access to the outside of the house, we can investigate and discover that we can use the outer fence in the indicated location to reveal a mysterious gap. This line def action has been there ever since we first entered the altered house, but once again it was locked and required the 8 artifacts. Behind the fence, the player is teleported in an unusual way, using an actor hits floor object instead of the usual line portals or teleports. Nevertheless, after fighting through the bushes, you'll emerge on a long and lonesome road. This area is another one that loops back on itself with line portals, so by exploring in either direction, you'll eventually happen across an abandoned car that's crashed into a tree at the side of the road. The occupant is nowhere to be seen, but the door is open and the lights and radio have been left on. The radio is playing a song that's become known as the most mysterious song on the internet. It's a piece of music that was recorded off German radio in 1984 and, despite a huge international search, has somehow remained completely unidentified to this day. By following the direction of the car's headlights through the woods, you will discover a lonely petrol station. You will quickly discover that things aren't going well on Shell, because as usual in these horror games, the first letter has burned out on the sign and the place seems completely deserted. If the player continues down the road on the west side of the clearing, they'll see a pillar of smoke rising from the forest, and by moving towards it they'll be able to find the remains of a fire just beyond a campground sign in the woods. There's nothing to do here yet, but we'll have to come back here later. Inside the Shell station, you'll find the shop is surprisingly well stocked given its state of abandonment, including some tiny sector hot dogs. However, the only thing you can actually interact with is the dispenser for the appetizing sounding sludgies. Pressing use in front of this will boost the player to 200% health. It can be used 5 times on the easiest skill level and 1 fewer times for every level above that, except on Nightmare where it becomes 5 again. After the last use, a little out of order sign will appear on it. Interestingly, the number of times you've used the dispenser is the only thing in the game that's stored in a global scoped variable, so it won't be restocked if you restart the level via underhauls for any reason. Use count is defined as an array, suggesting that the author might once have intended to persist more things across multiple attempts in this way. If the player ventures to the back of the shop area and into the storage room, they'll find an Atari joystick tucked behind a couple of crates. This is the 16th and final artifact in the game, and picking this up will cause another script number 35 to exit its loop for removing all the objects tagged 1624. These are the ones shown in the pictures in the mirrored house. This time, the only effect is to lower a new set of pictures into place on the opposite wall, in the same way as in the altered house. The player can get out of this reality by returning to the bushes they came through, but another way out is through the familiar-looking bathroom opposite the storage room, which will teleport the player into the same room in the altered house when the player walks over a line across the centre of the room. As yet another example of this WAD's astounding determination to keep the illusion going, the level of water in the Shell station sink is synced with the sink in the altered house, even though it's not legitimately possible to get here without filling it up first. Now that we have all the mirror artifacts, we need to get back through the mirror here, but the keen observer will notice that it's gone. When we stepped into the petrol station bathroom, we crossed a line that raised the floor of a sector in front of the mirror to cover it up. Fortunately, it can be restored simply by leaving the bathroom, where another line def makes the cover drop again. Strangely, this is the only mysterious change that I could find in the game where the transformation happens in a way completely visible to you. I didn't edit this line def action at all, it lowers its speed 64, and you can see it happen if you walk out of the door backwards. So, after restoring the mirror, we can return to the mirror world and discover the change we inadvertently made to the pictures in this reality. Just like before, we can go outside and lower the fence on this side of the mirror as well. This time the line def is locked to require the 8 other artifacts. The mirrored road through the woods is similar to the one we saw before, except there is no crashed car and only a relatively unnoticeable torch lights the way into the trees. The car is now parked untidily in front of the petrol station, and the interior is a bit worse for wear, suggesting the car's owner did not have good intentions. A lot of the shop area is now blocked to us by police tape, but we can still use the sludgy machine. Unlike its counterpart, this one can be used exactly once, no matter what skill level the game is set to. The bathroom door is taped over, so we can't teleport back this time, but the storage room provides a very welcome rocket launcher. There's also a walkover line in the doorway to this room with a lock that requires the game controller, which will attempt to lower the game controller picture in the mirrored house. But it's impossible for it not to have been lowered already by this point, and I can only assume that this is a decoy or a mistake. Back outside, you can see the same pillar of smoke rising from somewhere in the woods, and if you follow the road to the north, you can rediscover the clearing. This time, at the back of this clearing, there's a tree that has the initials S and A carved into it. Using the line with the heart will make it open up and reveal another portal, letting the player step through to a peaceful beach area with a half-finished copy of the same initials drawn in the sand. However, as they approach the water, they'll see that the beach isn't quite what it seems. The water is disconnected from the area they're standing on, and as they explore further, they'll discover that the scenery is decidedly two-dimensional, and that the whole arrangement is just part of a film set. Eventually, the player will discover a director's chair and desk off to the side with a slate made out of a mid-texture sitting on top of it. Using the line with the slate will change its texture, play the sound of it closing, then wait 3 ticks and instantly fade the screen to black. It also teleports the player to a small completely black space surrounded by a sector that will just move the player back to where they came in when it's entered, making it impossible to no-clip out. Therefore, there are no options left and the game ends here. It doesn't have to end there though. Opening up the tree doesn't just lower the floor of the tree sector, it runs script 22, which is called Final Secret Script. This performs the floor move that's visible to us, but the movement is performed on all sectors with tag 280, meaning that the tree back in the non-mirrored world will open up as well. The set line special commands will disable the portal lines in the normal world petrol station bathroom, preventing the player from getting back to the altered house this way, and curiously it will also cause the bathroom door to swing in the other direction, going into the bathroom instead of out. There are also some other actions that will become apparent later. Until now, the Doom part of this Doom WAD has been somewhat understated, but the pace ramps up considerably from here. As the player tries to leave this area, they will attract the attention of one of the things that was spawned by script 22. This is another custom enemy called the Mirror Vial. The Mirror Vial can theoretically be killed, but it rejoices in having 5 million hit points, so it's not very practical to go this route. Like the normal Archvile, it can revive other monsters and has a line of sight fire attack. Mercifully, its maximum range is 512, which is just over half of the standard Archvile's 896. However, it makes up for this shortcoming by having the no-clip flag, which renders it unbothered by small inconveniences like walls. The player's only hope of survival here is to run away, and to try to interrupt the Mirror Vial's fire attack if they can't avoid being in its line of sight. As they can't go into the bathroom, they have to run all the way back down the road away from the station and try to locate the spot where they came in. This is particularly challenging when lacking a map and fighting against blinding levels of fog and panic. There's a fence at the side of the road that marks the tunnel out, but even when they find it, the player's troubles are far from over. When they get back to the mirrored house, they'll find a Mirror Vial has spawned in the corner of the garden as well, and there's a further one up in the attic. Due to not being blocked by walls, they'll quickly start reviving the demon armies, and if you stay here they'll hunt you down very quickly, so the wisest course of action is to escape this reality through the bathroom mirror again. You'll first notice the altered house has also changed when you see a pinky demon waiting for you on the other side of the mirror, and there's a whole party of monsters in the living room, including a regular corporeal Archvile. After getting past those, you'll also find that the house has been utterly besieged by Hell's forces. Unlike the many other dramatic transformations we've seen so far, this one isn't done by moving the player to a new area. The monsters and pickups were all spawned in by script 22 when we opened up the tree. The script creates a long list of pickups and monsters, then gives the monsters the ambush flag so that they'll wake up as soon as they have a possible line of sight to the player. You now have to battle your way through the garden and reach the hole in the fence again. There is a small reprieve on the lonely road, but when you reach the Shell station you'll find it's hosting DemonCon 2023 with a vast crowd of assorted monsters and even a spider mastermind on the roof. She's actually a custom enemy that extends the normal spider mastermind class and has the no target flag set, meaning monsters won't retaliate against her. So that's fun. There's a heap of ammunition available, so the player is now challenged to get back to the forest clearing by any means necessary. Once they've fought through the crowds of grounded air forces, they'll finally be able to see that the tree here has opened up. If they make their way through it, they'll be awarded a secret and will emerge on a genuine beach with a warm glowing sun on the horizon. And this appears to be as much of a satisfactory ending as the game has. Being awarded the map's only secret implies that there's some finality to this path. The heart with the initials S and A will be fully drawn in the sand here, and you'll be accompanied by the best buddy dog from the Brutalist house. Unless of course you shot it, or the Nightmare dog earlier, as this was the object tagged 1646 removed by the dog death script. Whether or not you're accompanied, there's nowhere else to go from here. By this point we've travelled through multiple dimensions and have seen the house transform many times, but there's still more to see. There are some areas that you can get to by going off the path expected of you by the game. Some are very small, some are more substantial. If the player falls from the bathhouse, either through the holes in the walls or by slipping off the floating platforms, they'll find themselves hanging in the sky in front of a floating door. This door leads into a dark stairwell which continues endlessly upwards and downwards. It's composed of 12 segments that portal to each other, forming a loop with 6 repeating floors. Only a couple of the doors can be opened. If we call the floor with the door to the sky floor 1, then on floors 4 and 6 there are doors that lead to each other. Between them, on floor 5, there's a door that opens into a void of fire blue and a passageway that leads back into the house. Like many things in this map, the passageway is a line portal, and it will always lead you back to the most recent version of the house that you visited. When the level is loaded, the portal leads to the altered house, but when the fire dummy key is picked up, it will run script 44 and switch the exit line to the living room of the burned house. And when the player steps out of the overgrown or empty houses into the empty lot, they will activate an actor enters sector object that will run script 47 to point the portal there as well, even though I can't think of a route by which to reach the fire blue void by that point. The staircase can also be reached by stepping off the edge of the Brutalist house, which will result in the player emerging from a tiny dark cupboard behind the door on floor 2. But there's one place where the player can jump off the Brutalist house and make it to a window on the outer wall. It's just before going down the first hole on the route that eventually leads to the airport. It's another awkward strafe jump, but it's just possible to make it. Beyond the window is a small square room lit in a uniform unpleasant shade of yellow, and contains a television recursively showing the same room by using a camera object positioned on the sofa. By walking around to the back of the television, it's possible to use the line with the socket, which will unplug the television and also your own screen. This effect is done by script 71 unplugged. It takes the plug out of the socket with a very elaborate set of tiny sector movements, raising some and lowering others to make it appear to have become loose on the floor. After that, it will wait 6 ticks, then black out the screen and teleport the player to the same black holding pen that the slate did on the fake beach. However, it will then assign an action to the line in front of the player, so that when they press use again, they'll activate script 72 replug. This script will reverse the effects of script 71 to put the player and the plug back where it found them, and will then play a white noise effect from the television and change a large number of textures throughout the map. These textures are the ones that represent television screens, in this room the various permutations of the house, and even the ones in another hidden area that we'll come to in a minute. They're all displaying static on channel 3, and the mirrored areas have their own dedicated reversed textures. The meaning of all this is not yet known. One of the most interesting secret areas technically requires the least effort to discover, being accessible by being killed at any stage during the map and waiting. While dead, the object that represents the player calls a function called deaththink on every tick. Usually this handles things like dropping the player's viewpoint to the floor, following the player's killer, and listening for the use key being pressed to restart the player, but myhouse adds some of its own flavour to this function. First, it will wait for the player to come to a stop with no movement along any axis. Once that happens, it will save the player's position and angle into variables called spot and last angle, and set the boolean clinic start to true to enter the next stage of the routine. If clinic start is false, or the variable has died is true, or the player is in a sector marked with effect 115, which means instant death, then the deaththink function will stop and return here. If the conditions pass, the game will start using the variable death counter to count upwards as game ticks pass. There are 35 ticks in a second, so this code is waiting for the counter to indicate that 30 seconds have elapsed. Once that happens, it will start using a secondary counter, death timer B, to fade out the background music. Meanwhile, over in the render overlay function, which handles drawing HUD elements to the screen, death timer B is used to fade the screen to black over a period of 10 seconds. Once 60 seconds have been counted on the death timer, the player will be resurrected but will have the totally frozen flag set so the player still can't move. They'll then be teleported to map spot tagged 1964, and their weapons will be taken by using a function called deposit weapon that saves their identifiers into an array and then removes them from the player's inventory. In their newly teleported position, a regular beeping noise that sounds like a heartbeat monitor will now be audible to the player. Now that they're alive again, the player object's normal tick function takes over from deaththink. First, it continues accumulating the counter until it reaches 90 seconds. After that, it will subtract from death timer B, fading the screen back in again, until it's reached 0, at which point it will free the player to move again. Now that that's all explained, we can address the important issue of where we actually are now. We've been spirited away into a hospital room with the same kind of Doom cute aesthetic as the house. It even feels quite familiar, although calling it comforting would be a bit of a stretch. The player can walk out of their room to discover they're now in a circular corridor of very similar looking rooms without an obvious escape route. None of the doors to patient rooms can be opened, but the bathrooms are unlocked. The player would be forgiven for avoiding them at this stage, but unlike the ones in the airport, they don't have any transformative properties. Halfway around the circle from where the player's room was, there's a staff desk, and you can grab a key from the shelf behind the chair. The room number on the key pickup message appears to be corrupted, but it goes to a room with a similarly smeared room number sign just next to a pair of double doors in the corridor. Inside here, the player will encounter the unnerving sight of a silhouette visible behind the curtains surrounding the bed, and the continuous tone of a flatlining heart monitor. Fortunately, the silhouette is just that, a black outline of a figure placed on an arrangement of sectors and lines with their brightnesses set to 0. It can't move, grow, shrink, react to anything, or otherwise surprise the player. I checked every possible avenue I could think of before daring to record this. The room also contains two things that can be interacted with. One is an empty bottle of pills like the one on the way into the airport bathroom that I forgot to mention at the time. Like that one, it can be picked up, but it doesn't count for anything. The other item is the AED on the wall. When the player uses this, it calls one of only 2 scripts in the map that have names and not numbers. This one only gives the player a dummy item called AED token. Once the AED token is in the player's inventory, the tick function notices. It will remove it from the inventory again, give the player's weapons back, and teleport the player back to the place and angle they were in when they died. It will also grant them an item called Adrenaline, which does the same as a Berserk pack but without the pickup message. Finally, it will set the boolean has died to true, which means the sequence won't be repeated if the player dies a second time. I'm really not certain if this detail is deliberate or not, because in this WAD anything is possible, but the lines surrounding the bed where the player wakes up in the hospital can have an effect on the disappearing soul sphere that you might remember from right near the beginning of this misadventure. The lines are tagged 1976 and are set to run script 76 when the player walks over them. This script is called solid bed and sets some lines to block the player so that they can't get back up onto the hospital bed once they've left it. But inexplicably, the script also sets the lines tagged 1976 to run script 68 instead. Now the player can walk over these 5 lines once each to activate the Soul Sphere Allure script, therefore spawning up to 5 Soul Spheres in the same place in the garden of the first house. You might think this means you can get the Soul Sphere in the garden after all. By luring a monster out to the gardens of the first house before picking up the yellow key, you can make sure to die there, then activate the lines in the hospital and restore yourself in the garden with the Soul Sphere intact. Unfortunately, the invisible teleporting lines are still there in the first house garden, so as soon as you approach it, you'll be moved to the altered house and it will apparently disappear. I even tried some elite speedrunner techniques by dying in a way that would push me over the line, but it turns out teleport lines still activate when the player's dead. Still, it was a nice idea. On top of all of those, there are a couple of extra inaccessible areas. One of them is a mirrored version of the non-existent house, which seems like it should be possible to get to, but I can't find a route to it. It has a hovering door made out of a 3D floor next to the backwards sign, which could be a leftover from some experiment or other. There's also a skybox made with Doom's scrolling face texture, which mercifully doesn't seem to be used anywhere, but could possibly have gone along with the blue sky and fire blue void as some location in the endless staircase. As Doom WADs are so open to anyone who wants to load them up in an editor and pull them around a bit, I don't see many authors using anti-cheating measures on their WADs. As usual, my house is an exception to this, making sure to tease or punish the player for doing things that are unexpected. All the cheats that give you something have been disabled by overriding the cheat give function on the ZScript player object so that it does nothing, and this includes attempting to give inventory to the player directly using the console give command. Many of the messages that appear when you type in the classic Doom cheats have been replaced by including a language definition file in the PK3, and some of them provide hints for things that might happen. Putting God mode on will mention the mirror in the attic, and turning it off will seem to hint that the burned house isn't the way to go for the good ending. Asking for keys and full ammunition will chide you for wanting to skip over parts of the map, and using the IDFA cheat will tell you that it's possible to bring the super shotgun back from underhauls. The ID clip cheat will grant you the ability to walk through walls, but its confirmation message has been replaced with the warning, "Be careful not to clip out of reality in the wrong areas." Turning it off will lower the tension, with better safe than sorry. If the player does attempt to no-clip, they're likely to fall into a trap. Most of the areas in the game are surrounded by sectors with actor enters sector objects that will teleport the player away when they're activated. This works because they don't depend on line actions, and the player is still considered to be entering and leaving sectors even when they're no-clipped. These actor enters sector objects are also placed on the level exit teleports that are impossible to get to legitimately, such as the pad on the other side of the blue key gate all the way back in the initial house. If the player hits one of these, then they will find themselves transported to a maze of unpleasant windowless offices that are styled after the internet horror story The Backrooms. Appropriately, in the original story, these are said to be a place reached by no clipping out of reality. This is another place that's very difficult to navigate, with it being a large grid of very similar spaces which loops back on itself at the edges. While in this area, the player may encounter a wandering monster called Skin Stealer, who appears as a black shimmering ghost. It attacks by projecting fast-moving images of itself towards the player, and as it's just one short of having 10 billion hit points, it's rather pointless trying to fight it. Avoiding the monster is really the only option, and even though the exit is very hard to find in the large maze, it does exist. Reaching it will dump the player out into the endless staircase on floor 3, making it now fully occupied. There is also a backrooms area in Slaridnu, which is set up to trap the player if they attempt to reach the map with console commands. By default, a player will begin a GZDoom map at the player 1 start point that has its first argument set to 0. Awkwardly, this property doesn't actually have a name and is generally just called the arg1, but is used to differentiate between multiple player start points in a map that has multiple entrances in a hub-based arrangement. The additional start points are specified with their arg1 set to numbers above 0, so that the player can begin the map at different places when they're teleported there via a script from other maps. The player 1 start where you would expect to begin Slaridnu has its arg1 set to 1, and this is the start that's specified when the player comes to this level from the mirrored house. The action on the lines surrounding the teleporter pad isn't a normal exit action, it's a teleport to new map action that specifies going to the player start with its arg1 set to 1. If the player instead comes here by using the map or change map console commands, they will be placed at the start with arg1 0, which is in the centre of a similar maze of off-putting yellow offices with its own Skin Stealer. This area can also be reached by trying to exit the My House map from the teleporter pad in the unreachable mirrored empty lot. Landing here cuts you out of all progress. If there's a way out of this variant of the backrooms, I haven't found it. There is one last hidden area to discover. The line that lowers the outer fence still exists in the empty lot that the player finds themselves in once they've stepped out of the overgrown or empty houses, but like the one in the altered house, it's locked with the 8 non-mirrored artifacts, and you would only be in the overgrown or empty houses if you'd taken a route that didn't give you those artifacts. But if we look carefully, there is a route that we can use to reach the empty lot with the 8 artifacts in hand. We need to collect them by going via the Mirror World, Daycare and Bathhouse. Then once we've returned to the altered house, we need to use the fuse box and enter the burned house. This will give us the fire dummy key, which will cause us to be transported to the overgrown house after our second trip through the brutalist house and airport. If you complete 2 laps of the game like this, you'll be able to open the fence in the empty lot. Walking through here will lead you to the last area of the game, where you'll find yourself in a small space facing a lonely gravestone with a QR code on it. I didn't have any luck scanning the code directly because it isn't all that distinct, and if you look for the texture in the WAD, you'll find it under the unassuming name Dirt 5 drawn in a way that obfuscates the presence of the code. But after pulling it around a bit, it can be scanned to take you to another Google Drive link. The image here shows the obituary next to the one for Thomas Allard, and this one is for Stephen Nelson. This is the name and face we saw before on the files on the Google Drive, and is the apparent author of the WAD, placing his death as before he could even have started building it. And so the last area of my house really just leaves us with many more questions. myhouse.wad is an incredible example of using the GZDoom engine in unexpected ways to achieve an atmosphere that isn't quite like anything else the Doom community has ever seen before. And even though I've picked apart the mechanics of how the roots and scripting work, it's all been framed by an even greater mystery about the symbolism of the WAD and not even knowing who the author is. One of the things that strikes me about the way the WAD is made is that many of the house alterations are done in ways that are harder than they need to be. They resemble early Doom's very physical kind of scripting, with a lot of moving sector floors and ceilings around to show and hide things instead of just changing things directly as enabled by UDMF. This would suggest that the author really is someone experienced with older iterations of the Doom engine who was discovering modern editing features for the first time, or someone who has done a great job pretending to be. The result is a huge experience that I couldn't have puzzled out on my own, so thank you to everyone who contributed to exploring it on Doomworld, the Doom Wiki, in these videos and everywhere else. But theories are still being formed for the things that can't be answered just by looking at myhouse's data. Who is the mysterious user Veg who suddenly reappeared? Is any of his backstory about leaving and then rediscovering the community real? Whose house is in the photograph on the title screen? Does the recurring theme of bathrooms being unusual or dangerous represent gender questioning? And how did someone attain the mental state necessary to use Doom as a medium to create this tangled web of realities branching endlessly into terror and madness? Maybe we'll discover some of these someday, but it's quite likely that we won't. Either way, my house is a WAD that's going to stay on my mind for a very long time.